The Subcommittee on Research will now come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Scientific Integrity and Transparency. In front of you are packets containing the written testimonies, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witness panel. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome everyone to today's Research Subcommittee hearing on the issue of scientific integrity and transparency. An editorial in the March 29, 2012 edition of Nature magazine entitled, "Must Try Harder, Too Many Sloppy Mistakes Are Creeping into Scientific Papers. Lab heads must look more rigorously at the data and at themselves." I found this editorial particularly interesting because my background is a cardiothoracic surgeon and my professional interest in medicine. The editorial goes on to cite a recent study contained in this specific issue by Glenn Begley and Lee Ellis, which analyzes the low number of cancer research studies that have been converted to clinical success and concludes that a major factor is the overall poor quality of published preclinical data. This is one of the many similar studies that I've read. The growing lack of scientific integrity and transparency has many causes, but one thing is very clear. Without open access to data, there can be neither integrity nor transparency from the conclusions reached by the scientific community. Furthermore, when there is no reliable access to data, the progress of science is impeded and leads to inefficiencies in the scientific discovery process. Important results cannot be verified, and confidence in scientific claims dwindles. The federal government is the main sponsor of basic scientific research, with over $140 billion spent in fiscal year 2013. The American scientific community has made enormous contributions in many scientific fields from federally sponsored research. I believe our nation's scientists will continue to develop the breakthrough discoveries and innovations of tomorrow. However, scientists receiving federal funding need to be accountable and responsible stewards of taxpayers' resources. Hardworking Americans trust our scientists to be genuine and authentic in a way that they conduct and share federally funded research. The focus of this hearing will be on scientific research data funded by the federal government. There are key issues that data sharing policies should address, including what is data, how it should be shared, when it should be shared, and what potential costs might result in making this data available to the research community. We want to maximize access to data while protecting personal privacy, avoid any negative impact on intellectual property rights and innovation, and preserve data without ridiculous cost or administrative burdens. In an attempt to begin addressing this issue, the Office of Science and Technology Policy released guidelines on February 22nd of this year that recognize the problem of data access. These guidelines, intended for federal science agencies, are to be followed when determining a policy for public access to scientific data in digital formats. As part of this hearing, I look forward to hearing the witnesses' opinions on these federal guidelines. Our witnesses today offer input from a variety of scientific fields, as this problem is not exclusive to one scientific field, community, or discipline. I'd like to thank them for coming and taking the time to offer their expertise. I'd also like to thank the ranking member, Lipinski, and everyone else participating in today's hearing. With that, I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bouchon. I think now this is our third hearing in 3 weeks, and we have another one next week that I will now label you the hardest working chairman in Washington, D.C. It's good that good to be at work here, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. The United States has for decades represented the world's gold standard for scientific integrity, but no one should mistake this observation as an argument for complacency. In the Competes Act of 2007, which we worked on in this subcommittee, then Subcommittee Chairman Brian Baird included a provision on responsible conduct of research that required every institution receiving NSF grant funding to provide training on the ethical conduct of science to all students and postdocs covered under those grants. Today, all U.S. research universities have implemented research ethics training for their STEM students and trainees, which we all can agree is a good thing. The bigger challenge to the process of science is not misconduct, but rather poor methodology and bad statistical analysis that take a long time to uncover. or for that matter, discovery in one field that has broad multidisciplinary relevance, but take time to be known in other fields. To that end, the open sharing of scientific data is good for science and it's good for society. We must, of course, respect issues of privacy and intellectual property. But the more data are open, the faster we will validate new theories and overturn old ones, and the more efficiently we will transform new discoveries into innovations that will create jobs and make us healthier and more prosperous. The movement toward open data is not primarily about scientific integrity. It's mostly about speeding up the process of scientific discovery and innovation. However, there are some big challenges to the widespread implementation of open data. Someone must define what exactly data sharing is going to mean and how it is going to be done, beginning with a standard. The February 22nd OSTP memo, which the chairman mentioned, on increasing access to the results of federally funded scientific research, which, by the way, was also a direct response to requirements in the Competes Act, takes on many of these issues in detail. But specifically, here are some questions that we have to consider. And some of these questions were questions raised by the chairman. First, what does it entail and how much does it cost researchers to develop a data management plan and to prepare their own data for sharing? Do they have adequate assistance from professional information managers? Are funding agencies sufficiently aware of the costs and skills required for good data management plans? And how should they evaluate and budget for data management proposals? What are the IT infrastructure needs for data sharing, including technical standards? And what, if any, scientific or technical barriers exist to developing that infrastructure? What are the most important factors to consider in the economics of digital data access and preservation? What should be the respective roles of science agencies, universities, and the private sector in supporting and preserving public databases? How can these groups work together to minimize costs and maximize benefit to the scientific community? And finally, are there any policy or legal barriers for sustainable digital access and preservation? In light of the majority suggestions of a possible legislative outcome for this hearing, I hope that today's dialogue will include a thoughtful discussion of some of these practical issues of implementation. I know that all four expert witnesses before us have a lot to contribute to this discussion. I look forward to learning from them, because this is certainly something that is important for us to pursue, but we need to make sure that we are covering all our bases here and do this in the right manner. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Bruce Alberts, Editor-in-Chief of Science Magazine and Professor Emeritus of Biochemistry and Biophysics at the University of California, San Francisco. Welcome. Our next witness is Dr. Victoria Stodden, Assistant Professor of Statistics at Columbia University. Our third witness is Dr. Stanley Young, the Assistant Director of Bioinformatics at the National Institutes of Statistical Sciences. That was hard to say. Our fourth and final witness today is Mr. Syed Chowdhury, Associate Dean for Research Data Management at Johns Hopkins University, and Hodson, Director of the Digital Research and Curation Center. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize Dr. Alberts to present his oral testimony.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd just like to start by emphasizing something that Science Magazine covers repeatedly, which is the fact that our strength in science and technology in the United States underlines both our economic success and our military dominance in the world. As you all know, many other nations are increasingly making investments in this area, and I find it distressing that although this committee has strong support, long supported fundamental long-term scientific research, the investment in the United States has been stagnant for many years. The investment in this kind of research was 1.25% of GDP in 1985. It's dropped to 0.87% of GDP in 2013, a big drop. And of course, the current sequester now make our situation even worse. I believe that this is dangerous for America's future, for my grandchildren's future. But this hearing, of course, as we stress, is focused on the quality, not the quantity of U.S. research. I'd like to address first the data availability issue, which of course is crucial for science. Science builds by one scientist testing and building on and maybe refuting the data of other scientists. Very much a community endeavor. And the privilege of publishing in a journal like ours demands data sharing. Otherwise, science doesn't work. So our journal has been working on this. This is a special data issue we published, 14 long articles about all these issues, February 2011, and we're publishing more and more about this. It's accompanied by a survey, a useful survey of scientists, how they use data and whether they have enough access. And we've stressed over and over again that our policy is, quote, that all data necessary to understand, assess, and extend the conclusions of the manuscript must be available to any reader of science. At this issue, we announced a new policy that this includes computer codes involved in the creation or analysis of data. And I'm pleased to say that we're getting good compliance with those policies. Of course, there are problems that remain. You'll hear about them in the rest of the group here, but one I like to emphasize is guaranteeing funding for the public databases, the critical ones, funding long-term so that the community and journals like ours can rely on them. This is really a major issue. You know, in my field, the protein database, for example, is absolutely crucial. It's got 100,000 different protein coordinates in it. You know, if the funding lapses, then we lose all this. And these places play a major role in setting standards as well. And secondly, I'd like to emphasize that we need tools for interacting with the large data sets that are now increasingly provided as supplemental online information in journal publications like ours. So when we demand the data, we put the data not in the written paper, most of it, but most of it's on a big electronic supplement. And other journals are doing that as well. But we need ways to help people analyze that data who are not the original authors. And of course, every journal needs to stress a clear and complete presentation of all the materials and methods that were used in the research. So the other issue that's raised is data reproducibility. Mr. Chairman, you quoted it from that paper. My conclusion, and I've talked to people at Genentech who would agree with that paper that you cited from Bayer Healthcare, is that the scientific standards are lower in some subfields of science and others that we need to work on setting higher standards. In addition, human cells are incredibly complex, and it's easy to get a result that looks right when it's really wrong, and one can easily be fooled. Every scientist must be trained to be highly suspicious about his or her own results, and this again is a major issue. And finally, I believe we're overemphasizing research directly aimed at finding drugs at the expense of the high-quality discovery-driven basic research that's urgently needed to improve the search for disease treatments. We're just mostly stabbing in the dark. So my suggestions for improving the situation will demand a community effort from scientific journals like ours. We have a new policy since the last 3 years that every senior author for each part of the results being published must confirm that he or she has personally reviewed the original data generated by that unit, specifying where exactly those results appear in the paper. It used to be that we wanted one author to take responsibility. That's totally unreasonable now. Half of our papers have authors in different countries. You have to have a set of senior authors. We're developing checklists in various fields of science to help journals and scientists. There's a biosketch issue. People should not be listing huge lists of publications to impress other people who are giving them grant funds. They need to focus on their 5 or 10 most important contributions, and quality is critical, not quantity. And funding agencies have a role to play here as well. I just want to emphasize my own role at universities. I'm still teaching, I'm going to be teaching a 2-week mini course on ethics and research standards in this May, so I'm very much involved in these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Stoughton for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Thank you for the privilege of addressing you, and thank you for your very lucid comments. I agree with just about everything both of you have said, and I also agree in how important this issue is. So I'd like to spend my remaining time on two aspects. One is I'd like to scope the problem for you, and the second is I'd like to scope the action I think that is available to you here. So the first thing I want to say is that there is not a crisis of integrity in terms of scientists and scientist behavior. What has happened in science is that, like all sectors of the economy and all across Americas, we are taking advantage of technological revolutions. And what we're doing is using far more computers, far more data-oriented and data-driven research, far more high-powered investigation in all the research all across the sciences. This isn't just in the life sciences. This is in engineering. This is in English departments who are doing word counts in Shakespeare. This is something that's really pervasive in the scientific enterprise as a whole. And this is something that's having ramifications in the way that we disseminate and communicate science. It's not a question of personal integrity. So what this means is, to scope the issue, I think that we need to think about this issue in terms of reproducibility. So as Dr. Albert outlined, open data itself is a very broad notion. I think this needs to be scoped to data and software required to reproduce published results. And what that means to a scientist is clear. There are details, of course, but that's something that a scientist can understand, and how to do this. This is something that institutions in the scientific enterprise can understand. And I reiterate that it's not just about data. It must include the codes and the software that take that data to the published results so that those results can be validated and verified. You mentioned in your opening remarks about statistical errors, about other issues. I would like to scope the problem to this computational issue, which I believe is reflected in the language around this, digital data. And the reason for that is clarity. I agree with you that there are lots of, as a statistician, there are lots of statistical errors that are in the literature that are being worked out. This is in part because doing computational work is new to many fields. And I believe the core issue is sharing data, sharing code, and things like sort of biological materials or the mathematics and the statistics. Those will work out as corollary issues. Right now, the issue needs to be scoped on data and code that allow those results to be understood, validated, and reproduced by other members in the community. So secondly, I'd like to talk about the scope of action that I think is available and important for you to think about. The first thing is, as Dr. Albert outlined, scientists are very interested in these issues of reproducibility. As we know, it's a cornerstone. We don't accept scientific findings until there is replication, until there is validation by other people. At least that's the theory. And in my testimony, I included two articles that are, in some sense, manifestos from computational scientists calling for greater reproducibility. The reason computational scientists are banding together and creating these manifestos is because there is a collective action problem. It does take time to make your data available and to make your software available. It is easier to hack things up on your machine and produce a paper and never really look at the code or the data in the sense of sharing it. That does take extra time. So what this means is that scientists who want to do reproducible research and sharing the code and data that replicates their results are at a disadvantage because they don't receive credit for this right now. They generally receive credit for the publications. So steps like what Science Magazine has taken with data sharing requirements and code sharing requirements are extraordinary and laudable and very important. This is science, though. That's our highest impact journal, and it's much harder for lower impact journals to demand that of the authors. But this is where the federal funding agencies come in as another lever that exerts pressure on scientists and what they're required to do. So in these manifestos that I included in my testimony, you will see computational scientist after computational scientist calling for help in a broad sense, because people who stick their nose out get it cut off. And we need the federal funding agencies to work in an integrated way to help overcome this collective action problem. Now, how does this happen? This happens through the creation of and financial support for repositories that can house code and can house data. And this is something that can't just happen, I don't believe, from added money on grants, on NIH grants and so on that are supposed to fund these things in an ethereal way. I think this is more serious, and this is something that needs to be directly confronted, more similar to a mandate when you take federal funds for your research. Now, standards, as Dr. Alberts mentioned, the Protein Data Bank and these other institutional repositories are very important for setting standards. They come from the community level. I don't believe they come from the federal level down. But this needs to be addressed and recognized. It's no point saying we need to have reproducibility, we need to share data, we need to share code when they don't know where to put it, and there aren't ways for people to share it and access it and curate it. So I'll move to questions here.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Dr. Young for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you for the opportunity of testifying. As an abstract principle, the sharing of research data is a noble and meets with little opposition. However, when data sharing is attempted in a particular circumstance, the conflicting interest of the parties can thwart the exchange. So said Joe Cecil of the Justice Department in 1985. What is the current status of science in general and data availability in particular? First, where are we with science claims? In 2005, John Ioannidis published 2 papers of interest. In one, he asserted that 90% of the claims made in science papers are wrong, in the sense that they're not expected to replicate. In another, he noted that 5 out of 6 papers based on observational studies failed to replicate. I published a paper in 2011 and showed that of 52 hypotheses suggested from observational studies, none replicated in the expected direction, and 5 were statistically significant, but in the opposite direction. Begley and Ellis reported that 47 out of 53 claims made in major science journals failed to usefully replicate. Where are we on data sharing? John Ioannidis selected 10 papers from each of 50 of the highest impact journals, New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, Science, etc., and asked, is the data used in these papers publicly available? Overall, only 47 of 500 papers deposited full primary raw data online. None of the 149 papers not subjected to data availability policies made their full primary data publicly available. I report on 2 personal experiences. Dr. B.T. Ritz of UCLA made a claim in Environmental Health Perspectives that air pollution in LA County leads to low birth weights. Dr. Frederica Pereira of Columbia University asserted in the journal Pediatrics that air pollution decreased IQ in children. NIEHS provided funding for both studies. In both cases, I asked for the data sets from the authors. I also asked for help from NIEHS. I resorted to FOI. I received neither data set. Recently, I was informed that NIEHS does not have the legal authority to compel an author to provide data that was funded by them. Operationally, NIH funding, the Shelby Amendment, etc., mean very little with respect to data availability. Mostly, authors do not provide the data sets used in their publications. It's technically easy to share data used in publications. Others will discuss reproducible research, so I'll leave that aside. Just why are we in this situation, where most claims do not replicate and authors will not make their data sets available? In a long and illustrious career, Edwards Deming made the point that if a system is failing, it's not the worker's fault. That's the scientist. It's the fault with management. In this case, funding agents and journal editors. For over 30 years, workers have been admonished to do their work better and to make their data sets available. It was reported in Science in 1988 that there were serious problems with observational studies. Nothing has changed in 25 years. Congress, funding agencies, journal editors need to step up and manage the scientific process. They should require authors to deposit data sets on publication of their papers. Funding of data set construction and analysis should be separate. They should require data analysis strategies that demonstrate reproducibility. For example, any claim should be replicated in a separate data set before publication. Remember, The reliability of current scientific claims is only 10 to 20%. John Holdren's thing on Office of Science and Technology Policy, I think, is a welcomed thing in this area. It's not enough to agree with sharing data. It's almost 30 years since Joe Cecil stated the problem. Management should make the depositing of data sets on publication mandatory. This is a management problem. It's not a science worker problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Chowdhury to present his testimony. 5 minutes.
Chairman Bashan, Ranking Member Lipinski, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I have been asked to address questions related to data sharing, access, and preservation. I would like to do so from the perspective of infrastructure development. The other witnesses have already addressed the importance of persistent scientific data archives for reproducibility. I believe that strategic investments in data infrastructure also have important implications for our overall competitiveness. There are important lessons from our historical infrastructure development that are relevant as we consider data sharing, access, and preservation. The development of railroads initially led to systems that served regional networks, but eventually merged into a national network through a standard track gauge. With the development of automobiles, we adapted from early mistakes to adjust drivers' behavior through education, driving rules, and seatbelts. The development of the internet reflects a layered approach with different technologies connected through a key component in the form of two protocols known as TCP and IP. Broadly speaking, successful infrastructure development has relied upon a flexible balance of community and national approaches, social aspects relating to human behavior, and key components. In each case, as infrastructure evolved through community efforts, we reached a point where national coordination moved us to a more cohesive situation. In previous cases, the more cohesive infrastructure led to greater societal benefits for both the private and public sector. I believe we have reached a similar point with certain aspects of data infrastructure. From a policy perspective, the recent executive memorandum from the Office of Science and Technology Policy provides a useful framework for federal policies that would maximize data sharing, access, and preservation. The memorandum acknowledges the need for flexibility by federal agencies for the communities they support, balanced with the need for uniform guidelines when appropriate. There's one specific example that I will mention in my oral remarks. The memorandum outlines the need for appropriate data attribution and citation. The method for meeting this need is the persistent identifier, which is a long-lasting reference to data. You can think of persistent identifiers as an improved version of website addresses, such as congress.gov. It is a rough analogy, but the persistent identifier may be compared to having the same role as track gauge in the development of railroads. From an economics perspective, there's a greater need for understanding of costs. For example, some cost studies focus only on storage, ignoring related costs such as data center operations or longer-term costs related to preservation. Preservation of data ensures that we can extract value for the long term, noting that with data, preservation issues can arise in as little as 5 years. The development of data preservation infrastructure represents a case where effective partnerships could be formed between the public sector, private sector, and university sector, in which I include libraries and national laboratories. It is possible that the private sector will not focus on data preservation because there are unresolved research problems, it is unlikely to be profitable, and it benefits from large-scale coordination. Federal agencies could provide the funding for research, prototypes, and initial deployment of data preservation infrastructure. The university sector could then set up production systems that the scientific community and private sector could exploit for discovery and profit. From a technology perspective, it is important to remember that there are different types of data and different stages of scientific projects. Consequently, there is a need for a layered approach of diverse systems spanning individual researchers to large-scale national projects. Even with this in mind, it is possible to identify gaps that are common across this landscape. For example, today's storage systems work well for many purposes, but they do not currently meet some preservation requirements. It is worth mentioning that some storage companies view this situation as an opportunity for co-development with the university sector. From a non-technical perspective, scientists do their best to manage their data, but they do not always have a full understanding. Raising awareness and reinforcing the importance of data sharing, access, and preservation will be important. This type of awareness building in education is similar to the adjustment of automobile drivers' behaviors over time. In conclusion, I believe that we have an important opportunity to advance our data networks into more cohesive, large-scale infrastructure that will advance the scientific process and generate benefits for the public sector, industry, and the scientific community. I thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, and I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Reminding members that the committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. As a cardiothoracic surgeon, I'm very interested in this issue because I have to translate what's written into clinical practice. And so this type of issue really does affect real people. I can tell you the difficulty that any people like me have in figuring out when to change your clinical practice, when you're doing something that turns out wasn't the right thing to do, is a very difficult process that is ongoing. So I'm very interested in this particular subject. I'll start with Dr. Young. Could you give me some examples of where state and federal regulations were made without public release of data used to make those regulations?
Yes. I've taken an interest pro bono in air pollution questions, and an expert in the area worked with me, and we developed 100 papers that are key papers in that area. Then, being a statistician, I selected 50 of those papers at random and asked the authors for the data sets. I received no data sets at all. Many of these data sets were funded by the federal government. There are many regulations that are based on these data sets. They're key data sets. For the most part, these data sets are not available.
Just so you know, I have the same problem getting the data out of the federal government, so it can be an issue. Mr. Chowdhury, could you give me what specific infrastructure technology requirements are required for the storage of scientific data research?
There are several layers that are necessary to actually preserve scientific data. It begins with storage, which is basically just the bits residing on a hard disk or a tape or even in the cloud. But eventually, we also need to do things to ensure data protection. We also need to have to then do things to ensure that we can migrate the data over time. So as we start to use new storage systems, or if we have new file formats, we have to be able to move those data into those new environments. As Dr. Stodden mentioned, we also need to have access to the software or the tools that process the data, because in many cases it's not sufficient just to get access to the data alone. So the actual preservation of the data is this complex set of layers that go beyond storage. Storage is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. So we have to do all these other things to understand the context and the reusability of the data as well.
Do you think currently that university libraries or national laboratories are equipped for this type of infrastructure?
At Johns Hopkins, we've taken an approach of looking at 2 stages. The first is prior to investigators submitting proposals, they need some sort of consultation and support to develop their data management plans. In this respect, I do believe that the university sector, and particularly university libraries, have stepped up very well. I think most research university libraries are providing that kind of consultation to their investigators. The second stage is that once an award is made, then we actually have to handle the data, and we actually have to start preserving it for the long term. In this respect, there's a subset of that library community that has come forward to help provide that kind of support. And then there is the long-term preservation need, and even there it's a smaller subset again. It's in the preservation of the data where I think there remain some research questions, which ultimately, when they're addressed, they can migrate the support into the university library sector.
Great. Dr. Alberts, in a February 11th, 2011 Science Magazine editorial, you write that we will ask authors to provide a specific statement regarding the availability and curation of data as part of their acknowledgments, requesting that reviewers consider this as a responsibility of the authors. Do you think this self-policing policy works in practice?
We find that it's been working for Science Magazine. Our senior author, deputy editors, Brooks Hansen, has been deeply involved in this. And on rare occasions, we've had to make authors do things that they should have done themselves. But I guess we're fortunate we have a threat, which is we're not going to publish any more papers from you, and they want to publish in Science magazine. And as Victoria said, not every journal can make that threat. So I think this is a very important issue to emphasize. We haven't talked about the fact that I'm a biochemist, and I had lots of data from my laboratory when I was active scientist. Not all of it should be preserved. I mean, I tried to preserve everything. I couldn't find anything. So we also need different fields to decide what it is that we really need to preserve and make available. There's so much material being collected now that it's really important to get standards for different fields of what needs to be preserved and what needs to be put on in your publication.
Great, thank you all. I now yield to Mr. Lipinski from Illinois.
Thank you. I wanted to start off by saying I'm sort of going back to my days as a social scientist, and I'm thinking about not just the research I did and the data that I had, but also thinking about behavior. And there are not rewards generally for having someone had mentioned, I think Dr. Stodden, you're rewarded for a result in a publication, but you're not rewarded. The rewards aren't there to spend the time and the effort to have the data in a format even that's accessible to others. And then if you're talking about going further than that, how exactly you went through and you analyzed the data, I can't tell you how much paper I printed out of different ways, all these different models that I ran, and trying to keep track of all that. So it's not simple to do, and there has to be incentives. So somehow the culture has to be changed. And the question is, how do we change that culture? Now, National Science Foundation requires that you have a data management plan when you are applying for a grant. So that the NSF puts that in there. My question is, in a short period of time, if you can do it, how do we change this? And do we make it, should this be a situation where it's data available upon request, or should it all be available? Should it be put out there, published somewhere, or put on a site that everyone can access? And how far do we go? Is it just the data? Is it this is how I analyze it. This is the statistical package I use. This is how exactly I did it. So let me start with Dr. Stodden. I mean, what's your quick sort of suggestion on it? Sort of your 30,000 foot. What would you do if you could?
So I think the efforts that have been taken so far are really this on request and so on. And there are a number of experiments and studies, and Dr. Young mentioned a couple where that doesn't seem to work as well. You don't seem to get the response. So I think it is time to move forward to this being a standard. Now, having said that, as Dr. Albert said, there are data sets and problems of different importance, and you can imagine investing a lot more time curating a data set that has broad use and applicability and might underlie 50 or 100 studies or so on, versus one-off. But the change is really something that I believe scientists are willing to do and are working out standards. Like in economics, for example, this is a very forward-thinking community, and many of the journals have standards, and they do engage in data sharing and code sharing, but not even as much as they would like. And so I think this the complexity of the problem means that it really is not a one-size-fits-all solution. As you mentioned, it's something that comes from the field. But I would suggest that this is a standard, that it should be understood that this code and the data go open for reproducibility. And this changing the culture is something scientists are talking about. There's a special issue I can point you to in Computing and Science and Engineering that is called Changing the Culture. And it's about giving these rewards. So as Dr. Chowdhury mentioned, having these persistent identifiers allows citation for data and for code. NSF steps towards allowing scholarly objects like data and code listed on the biosketch and not just publication is a real step in this direction. And I think the scientific community will sort out how it values data contribution and code contribution and publication contribution. They may not be all valued equally, but we have a long history of doing this. Not all publications are valued equally. But I think that bringing this through citation and having the citation standards is a way to really change the culture and reward people. And I'll add one last point, which is there's a generational difference here, because these changes in technology, young people and young scientists and people who want to go into research, it's very natural for them to share data and for share code. And it's discouraging for them to enter a situation where it's suddenly this is not the norm. So this is something where I think there's also this opportunity that the culture is changing naturally on its own just with time as younger people come in and have these expectations for sharing what they're doing digitally. And so that's also something to capitalize on. And again, I go back to the testimony in that there's this collective action problem because, as you mentioned, it takes time. And so something, particularly from federal funding agencies, that can help push through that is really very important.
Thank you. My time is up. I yield back.
I now yield to Mr. Stockman for 5 minutes.
I have a question for Dr. Alberts. My wife is a NASA privacy officer, and I want to follow up on something the chairman related. In February, in your editorial you wrote, "We recognize the exceptions may be needed to these general requirements for sharing data, for example, to preserve the privacy of individuals, or in some cases when data materials are obtained from third parties, and for security reasons, but we accept those rare exceptions." Is this your view today?
We've had experience, for example, we had an experience with the Department of Energy lab where they weren't allowed to give us the code because presumably it has some security implications. So we do encounter those one-off occasions, but they've been rare. So we have to live with the law, and we try our best to do what we can.
Do you see other exceptions?
I don't know of any exceptions since that policy was made.
Okay, the other question I have is for all the witnesses. Many of you today also practice science. You are also members of the United States scientific community. Been a world leader in producing first-class research. How do you envision the mechanism of enforcing the sharing of data without hindering the process of scientific discovery and simultaneously minimizing the administrative burden of a scientist? Because I know a lot of professors and everything a lot of time fill out more paperwork than they do research. If you could each just go quickly through the...
Well, I think Victoria said it right. We need to mobilize our communities. I mean, I'm a cell biologist. The American Society of Cell Biology needs to help us. What does it mean for our community? And we have to take responsibility for it. And it's going to be different for the statisticians. Different people will have different requirements, and it has to make sense. And I agree with you that it's gone way overboard now at the universities. Every time I want to do anything, I have to fill out a form. So I think we should try to avoid legislating more flat requirements. If I want to interview students, graduate students at UCSF about their career options, I have to fill out this 50-page human use form. It drives me nuts. So I think this committee might work at pushing back on some of the meaningless paper and get some requirements that are more meaningful.
That's a great question, and I think it goes back to these issues of reproducibility. If you're publishing a paper where you claim that data and code are out there and available for it to be reproducible, then that's, in a sense, the starting point of standards in a community. Now, as Dr. Alberts mentioned, this will change for different communities and different research problems, and they can be quite different. But there needs to be this this expectation that the results, the computational results, will be reproducible. And then when you go and get your hands dirty and you try and do the reproducibility, then if it doesn't work or it does work, then that's valued too in the community. And I think that scaffolding and that framework is really there. It's a question of moving towards this default of openness rather than the default of being closed and then you request and so on. As I was mentioning to Ranking Member Lipinski, the default needs to be open, and then, as you mentioned, we have exceptions for confidentiality and so on, but those are the exceptions, and then the standard is really about reproducibility.
The first thing to keep in mind is that many estimates say that 80 to 90% of the claims that appear in scientific papers are wrong in the sense that they will not replicate. So I would focus on cost per valid result. Additional costs can be put into reproducible research and things like that. The total number of claims that are checked will go down, but the number of valid claims can easily go up if we do our research better. Thank you.
I think one thing that's becoming clear is data management is a complex and demanding set of activities on its own. It may not be reasonable to expect scientists to conduct their own data management, but rather work with a set of professionals who sit somewhere between the domain science and, say, library and information science. So I think there's a workforce development issue here. We don't expect scientists to be experts in IT systems or other kinds of systems. We provide support for them, and I think data management may be in that category.
Thank you. I yield back.
Now recognize Mr. Bear from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To start off with, I would want to make sure we don't give the impression that our scientific community and our research institutions are producing faulty data. We maintain a competitive advantage. As a scientist myself, as someone who spent countless hours in the lab as a medical student and has spent time as a faculty member and associate dean at the University of California, Davis, working with our medical students and our resident physicians, we maintain a competitive superiority in our research institutions, and I think Dr. Alberts touched on the importance of the federal investment in our research institutions. We also need to recognize our journals and, particularly our leading peer-reviewed journals. There is a rigorous process, having, again, submitted articles and worked with countless students, that you go through as you're submitting articles. Replicability is an important component, but also putting the information out there so others can look at it and provide feedback is very important. So we want to be conscious of that as well. As we set up our research institutions, we often are doing it in our trials in a very transparent way, funding multi-center trials. When we look at major projects like the Human Genome Project, as we talk about brain mapping, we will set that up in as transparent a way as possible using multiple of our institutions. And it isn't always just about replicability. It is about sharing that data and working together. But at the same time, and my question is this: as we move into this era of wanting to share data, we also have to maintain our competitive advantage. And we do have competitor nations that every day are trying to, get to our data, get to, the research institutions. We talk about cybersecurity on this committee. We need to be very conscious of what we're putting out there as well. So, I'd direct a question to Dr. Alberts. You talked about the importance of research funding as well as the threats to research funding in our academic institutions. Why don't you touch on that, and then if the rest of the panel wants to talk about how we move forward in kind of an open, transparent way, but maintaining our competitive advantage and protecting those discoveries that we're making.
As in my written testimony, I referred to this major project from the National Academy of Sciences when I was president to explain to Congress and to the public how fundamental knowledge produces breakthroughs. The first little pamphlet we produced was on the global positioning system. We started with the fact that physicists invented atomic clocks. They won a Nobel Prize, but everybody thought it was useless because it enabled us to keep time to a billionth of a second, and why should we want to do that? Well, you follow this progression, and I recommend that whole series. It's still up on the web. That, combined with many other findings of knowledge about the world, enabled us to put up these 24 satellites that produce this wonderful device that we all use and the military uses. And we did that over and over. And what's been true in the United States, remarkably, and I don't think people recognize, is we've been a magnet for the most talented people from all around the world coming here. And you just look at Silicon Valley and places like that. So if we don't keep our leading position as a scientific research place to come to, our universities, then those people won't come here, and they won't subsequently contribute their genius to the American economy and the American strength of our nation. So I'm quite worried right now, because many other countries, China for one, they see this very clearly. This is where we have our competitive advantage, is they're trying to gain it. and if we don't pay attention to that, I think we're going to lose this game. We're taking it for granted that all these great people are going to come to this country, but they're not going to do that anymore if we're not the best place to do research.
So I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree with your comments more, and also with Dr. Albert's. The American science is absolutely superb, and as evidence of this, I believe our discussion today actually reflects the high integrity and the honesty of that community in trying to grapple with these problems. This is not, I mean, these manifestos and so on I put in the testimony here, these are scientists who are concerned about the quality of the science and trying to fix it. This is not anything other than the highest integrity profession. I also wanted to make one quick comment about corollary benefits of open data, going back to your earlier point, which is, you probably gathered by now that I think reproducibility is important, but there are also issues in terms of access to the technology. So if you have the ability, the software tools and the data to replicate those results and those findings, not only can you therefore build on them more easily as well as validating them, but it also opens them to industry and to others who can then capitalize on this or commercialize or whatever they see as appropriate. So it opens all of these avenues towards economic growth that can't be overlooked, that are extremely important. And to your point about, well, what if open data helps our competitors? I think that there's a long history in the US of being able to capitalize on this and move ahead, and I don't think that maintaining a closure around our scientific enterprise does anything but restrict American enterprise and competitiveness internationally, and also threaten the integrity of our results. I mean, science moves forward, as Dr. Alberts mentioned, through skepticism and through questioning and through transparency and openness, and being able to share those methods and giving others the tools to replicate and also build on, commercialize, capitalize on all of this, I think is an avenue towards economic growth and an avenue towards STEM understanding too. When it's open, you can imagine smart high school kids getting their hands on this stuff and figuring things out and playing with it, and that's very real.
Thank you. I now yield to Ms. Lemus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my first question is for any of you who cares to answer. It is about OSTP guidance. My question is, do you think that the guidance provides appropriate flexibility to agencies in developing plans to improve access to federally funded research?
Stan Young, I read the guidelines very carefully. I think they're a major advance forward. The history is that if scientists are not compelled to make their data sets available, they generally don't make it available. The American Psychological Association, for example, just has started a huge effort on reproducibility. Their journals, there are 50 of them, have the author signs a paper saying, I will make my data set available. Studies have shown that 2/3 of the authors that have signed those statements do not make their data sets available. So I think there's some scientists are great. In general, there is no data sharing.
I do think the memorandum provides a good deal of flexibility for federal agencies and the communities they support. I do think it's also important to think about those opportunities where something may be uniform across different agencies. Another example that I would give is the memo talks very clearly about enforcing data management plans. Well, most reviewers in these early days don't even know what constitutes a good data management plan. So I think providing guidelines to the reviewers about what constitutes a rigorous data management plan would be a very important thing that any federal agency could do. And it would, of course, be customized to their communities.
Well, I had an experience like you have mentioned with the Greater Yellowstone Interagency Brucellosis Committee, where we were trying to get data on elk and the transmission of brucellosis from elk to bison, bison to domestic livestock. It was tremendously important because we finally have that disease pretty well isolated to the Greater Yellowstone area after trying for, almost 100 years now to isolate it, because it used to be prevalent in milk cows, but after years of destroying entire herds of dairy cattle, we finally have that disease isolated to the Greater Yellowstone area. But it's raising havoc, and there was a woman who was an employee of Yellowstone National Park who gave her entire career, paid by the taxpayers, to studying elk, and she would not share her data with us. I mean, she was taxpayer funded. So I have had personal experience with your frustrations here. Another question. Could you comment on the difference between what's been written in statute versus what's happening in practice regarding obtaining data in federally funded research? You know, any of you in your experience?
I have a lot of experience asking for data sets, and I will call out the country Finland. Every time I ask a scientist in Finland to send me a data set, I get it in return email. Given the electronic age that we're in, it's reasonably easy to pass data sets around. My experience in the United States is not nearly so good. I mentioned 50 requests for 50 data sets in the area of air pollution, and I got none. The psychologists know very well that data sharing, even though it's compelled by their journals, is not done there. There's a huge difference between what beautiful thinking people say about sharing data, and then Joe Cecil is right. In practice, quite often it's to the advantage of the person that holds the data not to share it. And so there's a real problem and a difference. NIEHS or NIH, for example, has a wonderful data sharing policy. However, they have no legal authority to compel anyone to share data. And so many times I've gone all the way up through very high levels at the NIH asking for data sets and have not gotten them. So the practice is very different from the publicity.
I'd like to just reiterate Stan's point there. Both NIH and NSF grant guidelines require data sharing and even encourage software sharing. And these have been around for at least a decade. And it seems to be unenforceable. And so when the executive memorandum talked about mechanisms for enforceability, I found that very exciting because, like as Stan says, things can be on paper, and then without that enforcement, then things don't proceed. And that I think is a real bridge to breaking the collective action problem and providing those incentives for sharing and rewarding scientists who do this.
Thank you, panel. My time's up, so I'll yield back to the chairman.
Thank you. I now yield to Mr. Palazzo for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stodden, allowing open access to federally funded scientific data may also create new business opportunities. What are your thoughts on this issue?
I think the evidence is clear. And one of the reasons that scientific research is funded by the federal government is because we can discover scientific facts and inventions and so on that then can, among other things, undergird economic growth through these creation of opportunities for industry. So something like open data and open methods that allow reproduction of these discoveries, I don't think it can help but fuel economic growth, in the sense that you can take these discoveries. Scientists don't develop things for market. They don't do commercialization or full development, particularly not of software and so on. And then it's perfectly plausible that these can be taken out and developed into products and taken to market and so on, if that's viable. And I think that that's something that's a very compelling reason behind open data and open code.
Do you have any examples of products and services that companies may be able to offer?
So, for example, some of my background is in image processing and working on standards like the JPEG 2000 standard. So this came out of academic research on how to do image compression, and then that's released openly with open code, and that's something that can be implemented and become a standard in the web for faster loading of Facebook or whatever it is, and or Flickr or whatnot. And it's these types of things that are done in the scientific labs, and then sometimes, as Dr. Albert said, you don't even see the end application. You're making these discoveries, and then it takes ingenuity in industry to then turn it into different other applications. But this happens absolutely all the time.
So, and I think you mentioned this in your testimony. Yes, so it's definitely a potential economic growth area for our country.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. Yep.
Now, on the flip side, allowing open access to federally funded scientific research and the impact, or what would be the impact on the intellectual property rights, which, innovation and U.S. competitiveness and things of that nature?
That's a great question, and it has, unfortunately, a complex answer that I tried to touch on in my testimony. The intellectual property structure that affects scientists was not designed for science, and there's two principal ways that it touches scientific output, and one is copyright and the other is patents. And copyright is something that works against, in the scientific context, it works against openness in the sense that a scientist who produces code or produces other copyrighted outputs like a paper, I actually would need to give you explicit permission to do this. The default is not openness. So this is something I mentioned in my testimony, that maybe this is something that we need to rethink, how the intellectual property system interacts with scientists who have completely different normative structure to, say, for example, a poet or someone creating a movie or something like this. It's a very different model. The other way that it interacts is through patents, and this is largely around inventions, not touching so much the computational work that we've been discussing today, but software is patentable, and I can imagine, this is actually increasing now, that that patentable code is something that's coming out of the academic institution. So I think this is something that we need to think about very carefully. If you think back to 1980 in Bayh-Dole, this was something that was put into place to encourage transparency. The idea being that giving these intellectual property rights to institutions would then allow them to patent and give them this incentive, a financial incentive to be open. Now, if we have standards of reproducibility where code is open and data is open, it doesn't make sense to have that same incentive to patent, because it actually becomes more of a barrier. Because in 1980, no one imagined you'd just go to a repository or GitHub or whatnot and click and get the code, right? It had to be this whole thing through a tech transfer office and so on, which is completely different, and now that's the barrier. So I think there's some careful thinking that needs to happen in terms of IP, and also around how we collaborate with industry too. The industry has very fruitful collaborations with academia, and those need to be worked out in terms of what intellectual property remains over the scientific output, so that industry has essentially they can sort of get some return on their investment.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their valuable and very interesting testimony, and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and they will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused and the hearing is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.